I'm listening though.
Yeah. Oh, it's recording good. Okay. Okay, I need to put this back on gallery view. There we go. Okay. So I'll just get started, shall I? Do we need, do you want to check in quickly or?
I'm just making a cup of coffee, so please start. Thanks.
Okay.
I'm listening.
Okay. I made some notes about this because I must admit I'm a bit sorry because it was quite a lot of reading for today. And the second article by Bateson was quite challenging. The first one, I think I got more out of more easily, but the second one I really had to go slowly and carefully to try and make sense out of what the arguments were and do some background reading as well a little bit. So I know that last week, Johnny, you wanted a little bit of help with the thermodynamics, and so I did a little bit of, I mean, really, I just looked at Wikipedia, but it was more to remind myself of things that I learned in my first year physics classes. You know, there are essentially 4 laws of thermodynamics. People call them, they say, the 3 laws of thermodynamics, but they've introduced a 0th law, which is a kind of setting the stage. And so the 0th law is this idea that in any collection of particles that are vibrating, which is what is the source of heat. Heat is transmitted through vibrating particles, right? And the hotter a substance is, the faster the particles vibrate. And so the idea is that if you have 2 masses that are in that are each in thermal equilibrium, what that means is that all the particles in the mass are vibrating at the same rate. So there's no variations in heat across the volume of whatever you're looking at. And so the 0th law is that if you put if two masses have the same thermal quantity of heat, if you like, or essentially it's a thing about temperature. If they have the same temperature, then all the particles are vibrating at the same rate. And if you put them together, they just stay at that same rate. And if one mass is the same temperature as another mass, and both are the same temperature as a third mass, then everything stays equal. Essentially, that's what the 0th law is. It's more an idea that heat stays put, in a sense. Well, except that we'll come to the second law a little bit later. But to begin with, heat stays put. The first law, so that was the 0th law. The first law is that energy is conserved. And this is actually a law taken out. It's not actually, it is the first law of thermodynamics, but it's also the main law in all of physics, right? Conservation of energy. In physics, it's conservation of mass and energy, but it comes to the same thing. So it's this idea that you can't create energy where there isn't already energy, right? So it's kind of, it is a very basic law, but it's, so, and all of this is, there's no whys about these things. This is just the nature of the way the universe works, right? So, so we can't ask why. That takes us into our other discussions, right? The second law is this, that entropy will always increase. So what is entropy? Remember the discussion from the Bateson metalog about models. Remember how do things get in a model? Well, a model is essentially a kind of entropy. And so when how do things get in a model could be restated as, how come entropy always increases? Entropy is the tendency towards disorder. And so the more entropy is, the more there's disorder. So, and the idea is that in any natural system, let's say a closed system, because I'll come a bit later to the issue of open systems versus closed systems. But in any isolated system, entropy will always increase. And what that means is that heat will always decay, if you like. That I said earlier, heat in equilibrium stays the same. Well, yeah, but over time it will decline because some of it will convert and be propagated away. And so this is part of the increase in entropy. So things tend towards getting messier on their own. If you don't do anything else, they will naturally get muddier, not muddier, what do we say? More muddled. Yeah, more muddled. And then the third law is the law of absolute zero, which I think should be the 0th law, and they should switch roles or something, because it's more, so it's the idea that if you took all the energy out of a system, then its temperature, then the particles move slower and slower and slower until eventually they would stop. But to stop, that would be what they call absolute zero in terms of temperature. So entropy is at a minimum at absolute zero. It's not zero because you can't define muddle as a zero, but you can say it's at a minimum at absolute zero. So, so these are things about the nature of physical systems, and Gregory Bateson, in the beginning of his first paper of the two that we're looking at, points out that if you're dealing with living systems, you can't just simply transpose over the rules from dynamic physical systems to dynamic living systems. But that said, the rules of thermodynamics do transpose, and this is part of the why he's spent some time talking about thermodynamics, because even in living systems, thermodynamic rules apply, but they apply under a constraint, which we'll get into a little bit later, which is the difference between a closed system in isolation and what they call an open system, which is a system that is exchanging information or energy or whatever with other systems. And living systems are always open. And so the rules of thermodynamics don't apply quite in the same way in living open systems than they do in closed systems. In fact, in closed systems, entropy will always increase. But if you look at the living part of a system, entropy will decrease in the living part. It will increase in that if you look at if you move outward far enough so that you're now looking at a whole system which is isolated, the entropy of the whole system will increase. But if you separate out the living part from the rest of it, the entropy will decrease in the living part. And this is part of the difference between what's going on in living systems versus closed systems. So I don't know if that helps at all. The next thing that Gregory Bateson does in the group paper is to talk about the equivalence between genetics and communication. Essentially, he's saying that what is a genetic code? Well, it's a code, so therefore it is a kind of communication. Just as we have ways of storing communication in our exchanges, whether those be memories in the brain or hard disks or whatever, which are ways of storing messages. A genetic code is stored in our DNA. So there's a kind of parallel between the way genetic information is manipulated through the body versus how an equivalent communication system manipulates messages through our exchanges at that level. So I thought that was a very interesting parallel to make. It's interesting because in the discussion the other day, Doug, you were there with the writing group. We had a kind of discussion that tangentially kind of rubbed against this idea, because we were talking about how on infinite conversations, like for instance, we had this idea that poetry is a kind of shared body, that when we share poetry with each other, that we are kind of developing a shared body. And so in a way, we're entangling issues of body and genetics with issues of communication and message in what we do here on Infinite Conversations. And so I thought that was a very interesting segue between the two conversations that are going on, the one here at the Bateson group and the one going on in the writing group. And Bateson also goes on to discuss the way both messages and genetics can be, are subject to these framing issues. So it's this idea of meta communication or meta levels. So it's his theory of logical types, which is taken from Russell, Bertrand Russell, and so that any message can be this, I don't know whether it's the sense or the meaning, I think maybe both, can be modified by reframing the message in a different way. And so he's careful to point out that there's nothing within a message that can't be reframed from changing from the outside. And of course, we see that with with humor, you know, like for instance, something that a politician says in one context, a humorist will take and reframe it and make you laugh because they've framed it into a different context. And so that's this meta framing going on in terms of communication. But the same can occur in genetics. So any genetic code can be reframed by other genetic systems so that it acts in a different way. So that's part of what he's talking about. And then he later on in the article, he says that in a group setting, simplifications will occur so that individually things stay very complex. But once you put individuals together, he discusses this idea of pebbles on a beach being rolled over by the action of the waves and how they will tend towards a sphere. And so that there's a kind of simplification of each individual pebble on the beach through the action of the collection, which is actually it's a mechanical idea, but it's close to the idea of thermodynamics, which is also essentially thermodynamics is a study of the laws of large numbers of things. In fact, there's a whole debate still going on actually in relation to quantum physics and thermodynamics, because quantum physics says that at a very, very small individual scale, things are all entangled and not easily separated out. But when you increase the numbers enough, everything becomes predictable through statistics. And so when does one become the other? And so there's a discussion going on between the two fields of physics about how to deal with those transitions. So in group settings, simplifications will occur. Bateson suggests that's true both of people as well as these physical systems. But that among people, you will either get a reduction of differences or you'll get an increasing complementarity between people. So the one person adjusts to be able to work with the other person, or they both, or the differences between them diminish over time. So he sort of lays out this idea of a group theory, and then he shifts from that to focusing on what happens at the individual level within this group context. And how does the groups, the operation, the simplification processes that take place in group affect how the individual works. And that's what brings him back to this idea of schizophrenia, which we understand now to be, although it's framed in the terms of, in terms around mental health and mental illness, we understand that it's actually a kind of shorthand way of talking about large systematic problems within our current culture, right? So now he introduces this work by, well, he talks about von Neumann, but he relates the game theory ideas from von Neumann to ideas proposed by Burton Bertil and Phi. So Bertil and Phi, the name was very familiar, and I looked it up. He's a biologist, but I remembered him as somebody who did work in thermodynamics. And so he was actually a biologist who was applying thermodynamics to biology. So it was very much this sort of so he made many contributions directly to the theory of thermodynamics and not just to issues around biology. And he was the one who made the distinction between open and closed systems. And so in the context of schizophrenia, in a way, the relationship between patient and family, or person who's ostensibly identified as schizophrenic, versus the family, which he considers to be also schizophrenic in a particular kind of way. In some sense, this relationship is more characteristic of a closed system than an open system, even though it is a living system. In a sense that it is stuck in a kind of mutual co-adaption cycle that isn't able to get outside itself. And in that sense, it's like a closed system, right? And the second law in a closed system will say that things will get messier and muddier and more muddled. And over time, people within those closed systems of double binds get messier and more muddled over time. So this is corresponds to this kind of transposition of ideas from thermodynamics into this context, because we're dealing with a very special class of living systems that have properties of closed systems. Just to read a couple of quotes from Bateson near the end of the article. This much is observable and may be summarized by saying that the schizophrenic communicates as if he expected to be punished every time he indicates that he is right in his view of the context of his own message. The double bind may now simply be summarized by saying that it is an experience of being punished precisely for being right in one's own view of the context. I have to say that when I read this stuff, it sounded so familiar to me. It seems to me that my family had many of these properties when I was growing up. And so I was very interested in some of the discussions and arguments. So he says, you know, how come only one child becomes considered to be schizophrenic and the other children don't in a family context? So he talks a little bit about that. So that's an issue that is relevant for me in my family context, because although I think we all suffered, I think, you know, we suffered differently in a sense. And the other thing is, of course, is how come people on the outside can't tell that things are wonky inside the family? When the parents are talking to people on the outside, they seem to be perfectly normal and ordinary people, and the sort of wonky dynamics inside the family never shows up. And of course, you know, my mother, I think, was the source of many of the problems in our family, but people outside thought she was a saint. They thought she was a wonder. I mean, you know, she had some of those properties, but she clearly had other issues going on. And so from the outside, people couldn't tell. So it's part of what makes it very difficult, I think. In fact, he says, I think Bateson says in the article, it's as simple as that. And then he says, I believe that this is the essence of the matter, that the schizophrenic family is an organization with great ongoing stability, whose dynamics and inner working are such that each member is continually undergoing the experience of negation of self. So this is this idea that of stability, where he explores the issue of how these aberrant systems are nonetheless extremely stable and extremely difficult to break and create a new kind of dynamics inside them. And we'll come back to this in a moment, in a few minutes. So that's what I have to say about the first article, the Dynamics, and then we get into the second article, which is the one called Minimal Requirements. And he states in the opening paragraphs of the second paper that it is largely a question not so much of understanding schizophrenics as it is to understanding how the lessons from studying schizophrenics might apply to other domains, which is a kind of, it's not quite what you expect when you come into a paper titled, what are the minimum requirements for a study of schizophrenia? Because it's really a kind of reverse argument that he's making. And it's a bit hard to get your head about what's going on. He points out, and I think these are very interesting remarks, that it's fun. So because it's this idea of taking the lessons from one domain and applying to another, which is pure Bateson, we've already seen it in other contexts. It's fundamentally a transdisciplinary theory. And it's also a transgressive inquiry. Because, as he says, the idea of looking at, so the whole idea of a double bind is that that behaviors are this vicious circle that develops is because you're moving from one level of abstraction to another level. And that's how the vicious circle, so double bind is a double bind because there are two levels of interaction going on. And the one interacts with the other level in such a way that you're caught in this vicious circle. But in typical science, what you do with any kind of study that you're dealing with in sort of classical scientific experiments, where you take the thing that you're studying, you stick it into a lab somewhere or into an isolated environment, and you study it in the isolated environment. But this idea of looking at the two different levels of abstraction and how they interact together, that transgresses this idea of the classic approach to science, because you're not isolating things, you're leaving things in their larger environments in studying the interactions and the flows of information between the larger environment and the smaller environment. So you're transgressing the classical scientific paradigm in doing that. And then he points out that if you accept that argument that science carried out in this way can't can't view things as things. It now has to view things as relations because of this aggregation, this nesting between the two different levels. And that in fact, once you admit that there is a nesting, you can't exclude the idea that there isn't an infinite nesting. That is to say, there are things that are round up in other things, which are round up in other things, which are round up in other things, which are round up in other things, and so on, ad infinitum. So you're stuck in this enormous complexity if you accept that, you know, which is why most scientists don't want to go there, because it leads to this very difficult issue about complexity. But of course, the point about the article that Bateson is making is, yeah, it's complex, but there are ways to tease out of this complexity principles that can be applied across many different domains. And that's what the article is sort of laying the foundations to do. Now, one of the things I wanted to make a remark about this is that we had the discussion a while back about the 3 different levels that we can attend to at a time. You know, that you can attend to the thing, the frame, and the texture, but you can't attend to other levels of above that or below that. And whereas if you look at many things at the same level, we can easily attend to 6 or 7 things at the same time. But across hierarchies, we cannot. We can only do it at 3 at a time. And what that means is that it's very hard to think about these different levels and how they nest within each other. We're stymied by our own brains, in a sense, from doing heavy thinking about this. So it takes maybe a kind of relaxation to do it, because in order to attend to more than 3 levels, the only way to do that is through peripheral attention, not through direct attention, because it's direct attention that's limited to the 3 levels. So you can only do it if you allow yourself an opening to peripheral information, which is part of the reason why when you read this stuff, you go, my God, I need to read that again because I think I missed the point. And you go through it again and again, and slowly you sort of pick out these different levels and start to make sense of it. So it's part of the reason why reading Bateson is so difficult, even though it's so brilliant. It takes such a lot of this peripheral attention to understand what's going on in Bateson, which is perhaps why not so many people, even though he was highly influential, why people find Bateson difficult, you know? So I wanted to point that out because as you're reading this stuff, you think, I must be stupid. I'm just not getting this. But of course, we all think the same when we're reading it. So it's nice to recognize that, no, you're not stupid. This is hard. And it's hard for very particular reasons, which is part of the whole point why we're looking at these issues and why Bateson is insisting on them, is because they're hard to do. So then there's a lengthy discussion in the middle of the second paper about the issue of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, the argument, I don't know how familiar you are with that argument, but it was a dominant discussion in the days when he was writing this. It's since died down. It died down for a long time, and then it's come back recently, but it's come back in a somewhat modified form. So the issue is, Darwin said that genetics stays genetics, that you can't, so the issue is when an animal is adapting to an environment, and the animal is learning to adjust its behaviors in a particular environment, does the learning the animal do get into the genetics of the next generation? Because the learning that the animal does is a brain learning. So is it possible that the brain learning descends into the genetic learning, and the actual learned behaviors then are transmitted genetically from one generation to the other? So it's this idea of do our learned behaviors transfer to genetic adaptations? And there was a raging argument at the time that Bateson was writing this that was still going on, even though it had been going on for a long time, because Darwin said no, and this guy Lamarck said yes, an unequivocal yes. According to Lamarck's idea, what you learn can transfer to the genetic level. And the sort of main genetic theorists of that time were all on the Darwinian side. The Lamarckians were more the counterculture, if you like, and the Darwinians won massively this argument at that time, and they thinking about these things long after Bateson was writing his papers. But in recent years, the argument has come back, and there is now scientific evidence that suggests certain kinds of information can be transferred from what Bateson calls the phenotype to the genotype. But the phenotype is learned behavior at the level of the brain, and the genotype is the information that's incorporated into the genetic code. And so there are now arguments that certain kinds of information can transfer from the one level to the other, but not everything. So it's a more kind of adjusted understanding of these things rather than an all or nothing kind of thing, which was the argument when Bateson was writing his work. And it's interesting, without fully understand, I must admit I found it hard to follow Bateson argument at this point, but he's kind of suggesting a way in which the phenotype can influence the genotype, but through a kind of reverse engineering, a kind of a backing up, that if you change the phenotype in a systems way, then you can actually get a transfer to the genotype, but not in any direct integration. It's more a kind of a systems effect from the result of many different things being done at the same time. Anyway, that's, I think that covers my understanding of it. I must admit, I didn't quite get it all. So he says, our approach to the problems of schizophrenia by way of theory of levels of logical type has disclosed first that the problems of adaptation and learning and their pathologies must be considered in terms of a hierarchical system in which stochastic change occurs at the boundary points between the segments of the hierarchy. So this is the tail end of this argument about phenotype and genotype, where he says that most biologists assume that any changes at the genotype occur stochastically, randomly, but he queries the term randomly, and comes back to the term stochastically. And the same also about learning. And there's a kind of a parallel between the stochastic nature of learning, the stochastic nature of genetic adaptation. But essentially what Bateson is saying is that adaptation and learning get into trouble at the boundaries between the hierarchical levels. So it's a restating of some of the stuff we've already dealt with in earlier things. So I have my note to myself here is, in the end, Gregory Bateson is arguing that the traditional isolating approach will necessarily lead to a strict separation between genotype and phenotype. So this is part of his argument that when you isolate things, you're led to a separation between the two different levels, if you like, between genetics and learning, but that a restored science, that is a science that doesn't isolate and deals with the different imbrications, nestings of levels, will be forced to deal with some interplay. Furthermore, such an approach restores a certain kind of unity between science and religion. This is my notes. But to quote Bateson, in breaking away from the premise that contexts are always conceptually isolable, I have let in the notion of a universe much more unified, and in that sense, much more mystical than the conventional universe of non-moral materialism. So this is where the punch hits. Having argued that the theory of schizophrenia can apply to other domains, he now says, it's not just other domains, it applies to the whole practice of science, the lesson from schizophrenia. And that the practice of science has gotten stuck in its own vicious circle. And in order to break out of that, we have to deal with this theory of logical types and the different implications in order to recover a much more holistic way of looking at the world, which I think is an absolutely gorgeous argument, and one that, I had forgotten from Bateson. So then he raises, at the very end of that article, he raises the issue of control, which is another bugaboo of our current system, because we got into the trouble we've gotten into with the environment, because we have made the naive and completely illusory assumption that a part of a system can control the whole of the system, which cannot be the case. It isn't the way systems work. Human beings are part of the total natural systems. There's no way we can manipulate and control the whole system, which is how we got into the mess in the first place, by thinking that. We have to accept that we are only part of the system, and that we can do things, and we can maybe correct some of the issues that we make, but we have to do so within a kind of humility that the whole system will have its own way of dealing with things. Then I went to go to Nora Bateson's text. The first of the four texts is essentially, well, in fact, both texts are applying this idea of the illusion of control to different contexts. So the first text, which was about about the statue of Daphne and Apollo, and Daphne slowly converting to a tree, which reminded me very much of the opening scene of Samuel Delaney's Dahlgren, where there's a girl who's transforming into a tree. So clearly Delaney was referring to this legend as part of the motivation for that scene. And that exquisite statue that Nora has there's an image in her book of this statue. I have to see, I've seen that statue in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. So it's a wonderful argument that we need to move from this level where everything is about control and desire and lust and those kinds of things and possession, to something that's more about pain and ecstasy and feeling in order to deal with some of the things that are going on. I don't do it justice because there's so much more in that essay that I'm doing here, but I just sort of wanted to touch on it because the two poems act as a kind of, or the poem and the small essay act as a kind of bridging into the final, the fourth of Nora Bateson's thing, which is Tears on the Bus, which I thought was phenomenal as an essay about the education system, right? And so she describes this incredible thing where she would head off to school every morning, and her father, Gregory Bateson, would take her to the bus so that she could catch the school bus. And she would look back as the bus was driving away, and he'd be crying, he'd be weeping, because he knew he was submitting his daughter to this idiosyncratic, archaic, completely irrational way of inculcating a way of thinking on students, on children. And he thought he was abandoning her to, to the life that we all have, right? Instead of this wonderful, inquisitive, poetic mind that she had. And she says, almost to her father, I think, well, it didn't happen the way you feared it happened, because I saw you crying. And because when I saw you, because when you think about it, I mean, I don't have children of my own, but I mean, he must have cared so deeply about his daughter that he would cry when he put her on the bus. Well, obviously, he must have had an incredible idea about the evils of the educational system as well. But so it's sort of putting his daughter into this evil system, right? And weeping about it, right? So, and as she looks back on her weeping father, and she thinks about this over the years, that's what saves her. It's seeing this. So I just think it's such an incredible story, an incredible story, I guess, except it's more than a story, right? And then she makes the argument, our job is to weep at the bus stop. So in terms of the transference of some of these ideas to the next generation, our job is to get people to notice that we're weeping and to talk about the issues, because it comes back to this issue of control. We can't control our own children to do this. So you give up control, but you pass over the ideas the best you can, and you trust that generation will figure it out. Which I thought is incredible argument. So, and also, a sort of a very realistic way of dealing with the educational system, which needs a massive overhaul. Along the lines of what she says, sorry, I'm going on about this because I was just bowled over by it. The education system, they were asking the wrong questions. Good questions do not have answers at all, let alone right or wrong ones. The ambiguity we need is unacceptable to the requirements of notions such as authority, credibility, and expertise, which is part of my problem with the university system. The violence of breaking the world into bits and never putting it back together again substantiates the kind of blindness in which we have separated ecology from economy and psychology from politics. So I'm just picking up some particular phrases from what she said. They need the next generation, they need a sci-fi grandmother, wise with humanity and rich with intuition, but a warrior of the digital and adept in urban professionalism. They need elders who are willing and able to think in new ways and admit when they are wrong. We have to allow this generation to make mistakes we could not afford to make, to let them play with the edges of our frames while we leave a trail for them with baskets of the most magnificent examples of humanity we can find. Reasons, great art, incredible mathematics, beautiful science, heartbreaking poetry, tales of history's turning points, all told from multiple perspectives. Seems to me that's what we're doing here at Infinite Conversations.
Thank you, Geoffrey, you clarify. I'm in the same boat as I guess everybody that reads Gregory Bateson. I can read it and not understand where he's going with it or why what he's saying could possibly apply to what we're talking about present day. So you gave it a great context there for me personally. So I appreciate that. And I too like if we start where you left off and maybe loop back around, I know John will have a lot to say about Gregory Bateson. I had, as one with physical children at the ready, my 5-year-old will be going to a bus stop next year or later this year. And in a way, I almost see his tears as not necessarily crocodile tears, but at the same time, she's witnessing this crying, and that's what in this poem, in this short piece, kind of allowed for her to have an expanded view of what education means and what it means to be a part of a complex learning system. So I'm contemplating personally homeschooling my child. Why didn't Gregory Bateson, with his great knowledge, decide to, well, let me just educate her myself? Why would he cry if he has some control over sending her to school? But that happens in the margins. That happens at the dinner table. That happens around the time that we have as individuals. So I took this piece, I think I accidentally read it before I read anything else in the book. So when I reread it, it brought back memories of, well, is this the same story or did somebody else write something very similar? So, but it hit home. I vividly imagine where my son will be when he goes to school. But we do have a certain amount of control. At the same time, we have no control over the educational system, but there are alternatives. And clearly, Nora Bateson took an alternative route, even from within the system. So I have personally, as a father, I have a fear of what the educational system can do for my child. But at the same time, here we are as individuals who went through the education system discussing these things. So I really appreciate that. But I'd like to know what Gregory Bateson did after he dried his tears and went home or went to his work. He got to work. He got to thinking about his current generation, his daughter's generation, and future generations. I'll stop there. I'd like to hear from John. Been doing a lot of paper shuffling there.
Well, this is all very difficult and rewarding, ultimately. Dealing with these paradoxes in these liminal zones. I remember, and I'll just start with quoting that last paragraph. He talks about, he's talking about physics, biology, psychology, and, the house of science. The foundation is physics. On top of that physics, you have chemistry and biochemistry, and you have biology, then you have, you go into psychology, and then you have social sciences, and you have economics, and it goes on and on and on. But the foundation is physics. And I believe he's really doing many things in these two essays. He's looking at the relationship between the I, personal pronoun I, and the group, in the family, but also beyond the family. And that network of relationships. And he's also looking, I believe, at the relationships between the different disciplines as we move from physics to biology, to sociology, to psychology. And I believe he's questioning and really critiquing, I think, some of the slippery slopes we're on when we try to reduce psychology and biology to physics. And the difference, as you pointed out, Geoffrey, between living and non-living systems and between open and closed systems, and how you can study a closed system that you've basically roped off from everything else, and you can extract from that certain laws. And then you try to apply that reductive tendency to explain other kinds of phenomena that are not closed off, but that are basically in open systems. And that, I think, he's looking at that tendency, and the tendency to try to extract certain laws and then to predict and control based upon those laws that you have extracted. And how slippery that slope can be. And I think he says it so well, the difference between certain kinds of thinkers and other kinds of thinkers and different ways of doing science. And I'm just going to quote him, that last paragraph. He's talking about control and the ugliness that control can create in living systems, and especially between different persons. In such a world, the problems of control become more akin to art than to science, not merely because we tend to think of the difficult and the unpredictable as context for art, but also because the results of error are likely to be ugliness. Let me then conclude with a warning that we social scientists would do well to hold back our eagerness to control that world which we so imperfectly understand. The fact of our imperfect understanding should not be allowed to feed our anxiety and so increase the need to control. Rather, our studies could be inspired by a more ancient, but today less honored motive, a curiosity about the world of which we are a part. The rewards of such work are not power, but beauty. I think that's a beautiful paragraph. And I'm also reminded of, like if you take a circle and you draw a line in the middle of the circle, and one side is A, you label A, and one side you label B. The circle is divided by the line, but the line is neither A nor B. And this, I believe, is a basic distinction. I think he draws a lot on Gordon Spencer Brown, who wrote The Laws of Form. He also draws a lot on Charles Sanders Peirce, who talks about the triadic principle, firstness, secondness, thirdness. So if you have a circle, it's been divided by that line into an A or a B. And the A moves across the line to B, and then from B goes across that line again to A. You have a network of relationships. And this is, I think, what Gordon Brown was calling a distinction, a cut. I think we were all working with Erin Manning, and remember how she talks about the cut and who makes the cut? And this is not obvious where the cut is, especially if you're moving back and forth across that line, sometimes having amnesia. You're over in A, then you went to B, you forgot all about A. Then what happens if you go from B back to A, and you remember that you were in B and that you had been in A, and you're back in A? I think what you have here is poetry. Remember our friend T.S. Eliot, to return to the place where you started from and to know the place for the first time. And this is slippery and it is transgressive. And so I think Spencer Brown, Charles Sanders Peirce, Russell, who with this theory of types, they were all wrestling with different kinds of logics and how to deal with the tradition of the Aristotelian logic, which always excluded the middle. And I believe that is a tension, that is an area of enormous tension that I believe Bateson consistently points out. And I could say so much more about this because it is so slippery. But I want to think about that boundary again. There was a dialogue I had earlier. Doug was there. We were talking about biosemiotics, and I'm drawing a lot of my comments from this book by Jesper Hoffmeyer, Biosemiotics. He is a student of Bateson. He talks a lot about Bateson. I think he updates Bateson in really interesting ways. But the idea of a boundary in a cell, if the cell has, and I'm not a biologist, but just to repeat some of the basic features he's describing, the boundary is made up of hydrophilic and hydrophobic components. So there's an inside of the boundary and there's an outside of the boundary. And it's made up of what hates water and what loves water. And if you have this love-hate of water, you have something that can let some things out and keep some things in. And this, I think, is a miracle. When none of us would be here if this had not happened. And then you have the DNA, the RNA, and the messages given and received, and the very crude formulations of Crick and Watson, which come out of a very first order way of thinking about DNA. Later explorers of DNA like Lewontin, for instance, Richard Lewontin, says they got it all wrong. DNA is not the brain of the cell. The DNA does not cause anything. The DNA is inert, and and the cell uses it. The cell, what's happening in the cell and beyond the cell, is reading the DNA. And reading it in such a way that it can be used to orchestrate these living processes of what's inside, what's outside, what's beyond, what's within. And once again, size and shape are really primary questions. So I think the grandeur of this biosemiotic move that is being made by Hoffmeyer and by many thinkers, and by Bateson. Bateson, I think, they all point to Bateson as the pioneer here. It's the difference between, there are different kinds of codes we use. Is the word bicodal? We have multiple codes. We have analogical codes as living systems, and we have digital codes, which are, like 5 fingers, the letters of the alphabet. The letters of the alphabet can be combined to form sentences and paragraphs. We are able to listen to strings of sentences, and we're able to, our auditory systems are able to punctuate those sentences so that they can make sense. So these are digital codes that are in relation, are connected to the analogical. Look at my hand right now. I'm making a gesture. This is a communication. This is a meta communication or a para-communication about my verbal content. And these are the kind of things that, we can't do without. How do you communicate anything if you're sitting on your hands? That would be a tremendous disservice to the persons who are listening to you, because, we have this sense of rhythm and this movement and what's important. And I'm inflecting the tone of my voice in such a way as to emphasize certain kinds of words and create some sort of flow state in my hearers, in those who are listening. So I think we're doing this all the time and we're not paying attention to it very often. The analog or the non-verbals, many thinkers, many people who work in this area believe has much more impact than the digital, than the language. And I believe Bateson pointed this out. We mix messages, and the cat is on the mat, I lied when I said the cat is on the mat. Mixed message. Also, it's a referential statement. That's a statement about the statement. The listener could say, I am aware that you are mixing messages. And that would be coming, I think, from a second order or a third order. This is what he's saying, how if a healthy person can have that response saying, hey, you're mixing messages here. You're saying one thing and doing something else. You're making a verbal statement, but your nonverbal communications are conflicted with that. Like, I love you. Come give me a kiss. Once again, this is a clear indication that this person is communicating something that's very mixed. And if you're a child and your mother says, come give me a hug, and when the child hugs the mother tenses up. And then the mother says, don't you love me? This can very much confuse a child. It can confuse an adult as well. But an adult who can say, or a person who could say, Mom, when you ask me to give you a hug, and then you tense up, and then you ask me, do I love you? You're mixing messages. I think that person is able to take a meta perspective on the communique and offer a different kind of message. Now, if the mother who hears that slaps him, we have another kind of response. And I've had these responses. I swim. I swam. I swam in an ocean of mixed messages, double messages. Many of them were hostile to my identity, as my identity had not been even fully developed yet. And I've had to, through trial and error, and through trial and feedback, had to, negotiate and renegotiate and pay real good attention to the structure and of these communiques and where is the power, the symmetry and the asymmetries. And you can affiliate with certain people, and it's your choice. You can come and go. But then if you're in a work environment and there's a boss who is telling you this is what's real, you better make a decision about how you're going to work in that system. You may decide to leave, but there may be you may be serving multiple interests by stay. But if you do stay, you may want to bring something else that your boss maybe have conflicts about. And this is where I think the whistleblower is necessary to sustain healthy organizations. But the whistleblower is often the one who loses his job, his or her job, even though the system is benefited by that whistleblower's participation. But I think this is all first order. We're moving to a second order now, where we're not objectifying the elements of the system that's over there and manipulating and controlling it by this observer over here who's separate from that system over there. We're now moving, I think, towards a second order culture where we have two-way, three-way, four-way communiques. And we have to sort through them for their value. Do we share this value? Which is almost always driven by aesthetics. And I think this is where Bateson was such a pioneer in talking about beauty and how aesthetic relationships were not things that can be isolated in little boxes and little flow charts. We are complex relational fields in constantly being shaped and reshaped through our participation. So once again, and pardon this long digression, but if we look back at the cellular unit, and I believe we can extract certain patterns and meta patterns, as I believe Bateson did, to our biological and our social worlds. There is the boundary with the inside. The boundary has an inside and an outside, and there's elements that go beyond that boundary and return. Those are transgressive moves. And then there's the unit of the DNA, which is a digital code. thank God we have a digital code, or we would have no memory whatsoever, because the digital is what allows us to have, it's a great code for memory. So that, but the memory is not, although it's digitalized, which is great, it gives some stability from which those other elements, which are analogical, can interpret and share and make agreements, make commitments, and create networks of relationality. As cells are not isolated. They're within tissue, they're within organs, they're within organisms, they're within environments. And all of that is transgressive. There's crossing beyond boundaries, returning to boundaries, maybe going beyond a boundary and never coming back. Maybe several generations later, there will be an echo or a trace, and that can return in certain ways. So I think, and also just as to bring a coda to this sort of long solo I'm losing track of, and I think this is what happens when you read Bateson. He's really exquisite, but he also opens up these liminal spaces as you read him. I remember when I was a boy, and all of this stuff about homosexuality and being such a taboo, and I was feeling very weird feelings, and I noticed right away they were transgressive, because I presented my gender presentation was condemned by my mother, by my grandmother, by my father, by just about every adult. I noticed that, oh, boys can act one way, but they cannot act the way a girl can act. And that's a real bummer, because I think the girls have a better deal. Because they were allowed to express certain ranges of affects and emotions and participate in certain kind of play, which boys were not allowed to do. And it was very taboo for a boy to love to read and to get lost in books, and then to read a book or to see a movie, and then go out into the backyard and dress up like one of the characters he read about in the book, or one of the characters he saw in the movie, and create a performance, which I was extremely prone to do. I like to dress up, create costumes. It could be a spear or a bow and arrow, or with a toga, and reciting "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." But so sometimes I actually built a cross. I saw The Greatest Story Never Told about Jesus and his crucifixion, and I fashioned a cross. I put it on my back, and I walked up and down the street with this cross on my back. Then I went back to the backyard. I propped it up against a fence, and I climbed up onto it and held onto the cross. And there I was, the crucified Christ. And I did gather an audience. But I look back on it and say, what in the world was I thinking? Because it put me at great risk. Because, the adults around me were not ready for this. Now that was in the 50s, and this is before the civil rights movement had really kicked off. It was in the Deep South, where these codes were maintained in a very rigid way, which I don't think so now, because of people like me who were transgressive and who came forward and created these forums in pockets of cities, these urban centers always had an underclass, or a group of outsiders. They called it Bohemia. And those were where those rules, those codes were transgressed in a very creative way. And sometimes it could be destructive. So I think that's where I'm coming from, is and when I started to read Bateson back in the 90s, and I was working with very stressed communities that were being marginalized and rejected, how we work with that had a lot to do with that ability to triangulate from the margins. And I believed enough of us were doing that. Some of us consciously, some of us very unconsciously, like myself. But when I read Bateson, I recognized right away, this is an ally. He gets it. And we were able, I believe enough of us were able to transgress and to create a wider and wider contexts. It's not about black or white or Asian or Jew or Gentile or Muslim or, you know, this erotic urge, this erotic desire operates on many different levels, emotional, spiritual, as well as the physical. And it affects many different groups of people from all walks of life, from all over the world. And this, I believe, can become, as I think William Conley talks about, this as we were transitioning to this new way of thinking about nature and culture. And he talks about the gay movement and how successful it was, and how we need something like the gay movement to make the possibility of an eco-economic, bio-informatic, social worlds, post-money, post-capitalist. And I think this is very tricky, because many people, as we all know, including myself, we're hardwired into this money scheme. And making money is, when that dominates, we are at high risk of losing our functionality in these, because there is limited growth. And we're going to have to, and the fossil fuels are we're running out of fossil fuels. And so we have to make some sort of systems transition. And if enough of us are alerted to this and make it important, I believe, we have a few decades. But it's not predetermined or pre-given. I believe that our participation and our observer participation, we have to find a way of creating safe enough social spaces, as we're doing now and at the Cosmos, to create boundaries that are permeable, so that we can, I think, have these safe to fail experiments and move these kinds of possibilities forward. Anyway, and I think that's going to be driven by aesthetics. I think aesthetic relationships and beauty, rather than brute power, is a value that, if widely shared, I think would move us toward this second order capacity I believe we have. Thank you. Sorry about the long-windedness of that. That was definitely an improv, but I think as we get a chance to use this technology, and we're creating an archive here, I don't have to rely upon my very feeble memory to remember what you guys said or what I said. I can just play this back. So in a way, it's this. Thank God for the digital, because we have an archive, we have a record. And when I think we visit this archive, it enhances our self-reflexive capacities. And, oh, I didn't remember it that way. I remembered it this way. But how funny. I have this archive now, which has preserved and stabilized certain features of the discourse that would not have been stabilized if I had relied entirely on my analogical capacity. So
would our recordings be genetic or phenotypic material? Like, is this something we?
Well, I would defer to Geoffrey on that one. I want to pass the buck.
The argument is they would be phenotypical.
Right.
But if there's entanglement between so the current arguments around entanglement between phenotype and genotype have to do with trauma in part. So there are indications that certain forms of trauma which are learned are passed into the genetic code. This, I suppose, some level of enlightenment might also be transmitted. If there's one, maybe there's the other, but I don't know how that would occur.
So I think it will tie in. This was a question I had earlier. Is the research solely human-based, or is it basing on animal evolution? I'm sure at one point, once it involved Darwin, or when you discuss Darwin, then it's speaking of universal biological evolution. But
yeah, I didn't have
like
time to. It's a really good question, Doug. I didn't have time to do. I really feel maybe for next time I'll dig around a little bit and see if I can find out a bit more about what the current arguments about this are.
Because I'm interested how the cultural plays into the evolution. So what we're doing here is a cultural evolutionary phenotypic presentation that,
yeah.
Of course, someone in Germany who's not on the site will not have access to anything going on online. Thus, they will not be influenced unless, say, Ed or another German individual who frequents the site maybe passes on that idea that was taken from the site.
But if we went back to Bateson's argument, there's sort of, I mean, it comes back to the final comments of Johnny about the way, about the challenges that we face and the way there needs to be some massive and, to our view, probably transgressive transformation needs to occur in order for us to survive. I mean, we've had this discussion several times. And in such a process, which is at the systems level, so it's not a process. So this is part of the thing that we're struggling with, I think, on this side, is that on Infinite Conversation is we're all worried about the coral reefs and the disintegration of the environment. I mean, coral reefs is massive because they're at the bottom of the food chain. And so if the coral reefs collapse completely, the entire food chain is in danger. And if the entire food chain is in danger, all human life is in danger. And so, you know, and unfortunately, not just the coral reefs, you know, the bees and, you know, there are many other species at the low level that are in trouble. And, you know, so if we lose several of them, we're all gonna go, you know? So that's the sort of crisis that we're facing. And so we worry about it and we think, well, what do we do to change it? And it's perfectly valid as an approach to think about what I can do to change it. But ultimately, and this is, I think, what both Gregory Bateson and Nora Bateson are saying, is ultimately we do the best we can, but we are not going to control the system, even to save ourselves. We have to do the best we can and then trust that the system will take care of the rest of it for us. Because we cannot engineer ourselves into a solution this way. So it's a tricky argument, and it's a tricky, because it doesn't mean if you abandon all the effort, well, it's definitely not going to happen. It's just that we cannot get there just by sheer will and sheer power. I think you're right, Johnny. In a way, the aesthetics is possibly the only thing that will get us there, because power won't.
Right, and if I love the bees, and I see them as I did 10 years ago, coming out in swarms, and they obviously looked confused, and they were doing very odd kind of things, like floating into my coffee cup or landing on my shoulder, and it looked like they're and I was like freaked out because they were all over the place. And then it was like 6 months later, they started talking about they were massive die-offs, along with tree frogs and other kinds of little critters. And then it becomes increasingly alarming to the agriculturalists who their bees are an essential part of agriculture. and that the bees go out and pollinate flowers and, you know, pollinate crops. I mean, this is so important. So if you're using where's the chemical that is being used that's disrupting and causing this kind of brain fog? It looked like to me that the bees had been drugged or were extremely disturbed and were dying off. So I think these are the kind of things that, I think there are enough people who are alarmed for a variety of reasons, and also are motivated because they love bees. I mean, what are we going to do? How can springtime ever be a miracle if we don't have any bees hovering around the garden outside or outside the tree? Excuse me, but I'm going to start to cry. It hurts. It hurts to see other creatures marginalized and ignored. And I think it's going to be fatal if we don't pay attention to how much it hurts. And then we get motivated. And then we can create different kinds of discourses. And then we can draw upon different ways of, we can use first person, second person, third person. And what's objective and what's useful and what is posing as objective, which is not objective at all, but intentionally used to paper over or distort this kind of phenomenon. So I think we have to be very, very sensitive to the intentional malpractice that's going on. And I think many of us are. And we're doing our best, I think, to communicate and to meta-communicate to one another. And with the skills of sponsorship, and I care very much about what you think and how you feel. And rather than just rigidly critique you and try to shoot down anything that appears in your performance that doesn't match my own. And I think that kind of moving from control and predict to an aesthetic appreciation of, and a willingness to appreciate the ambiguity. I think that's driven by, I think, the aesthetic. And we need both. I mean, we do need digital, but we need digital that can, but if we're only looking at the digital, and we're ignoring the analogical, we're failing to appreciate the vast differences between biotic and abiotic systems. And this is what I have tried to present coherently in my own behavior with some of my colleagues here, who I believe who are in that in-between as I am. But I think we're trying to, that's why I think Geoffrey is saying it's not all technological. This technology is not going to be the main driver of this. So that's the analogical portions of our experience. We need to be able to, which is what art and play and music and it's all about. We have to find a way of using these, of being bicodal. We have more than one code. And we can't privilege one code over the other code because especially the digital is much, the analogical is infinitely more complex than the digital.
I appreciated Nora Bateson's cry against terminology like resources sustainability, which is one that, you know, people tend to put out as being very progressive. And, you know, she's right, sustainability is all about resource maintenance, right? It's a kind of, and she talked about stewardship, which is also, you know, and these are, I thought that was such an interesting critique of certain parts of the current environmental movement, which focus on power issues rather than, you know, clearly power is part of the story, but beauty is the other part, and it's often neglected.
And I don't know if Gregory Bateson necessarily laid down any principles, but like John quoted at the end, he does focus, well, let's focus on the aesthetics, the beauty. So my question is, or how big is our aesthetics? So there's the general term aesthetics we can all use and think, oh, art or beauty or this or that, but it can be a concept that applies to any field of science, anything. And if we are to have a larger aesthetics, if I use work or my personal self as an example, I'm focused on the three of us here, and fashion, acting, and presentation were foreign things to me. I as a introverted individual, I would be inside my shell, not concerned with my shell. I can be not my body, but not just necessarily the mind. There's the world around me, but this presentation is something that deserves, for at least someone like me, for someone that didn't take it into consideration, my aesthetics has increased. So I'm not going out and buying the latest trend. I'm making trends of my own. I do my own hair. I accidentally, or when I was shaving off my bulky beard, I shaved a little bit too much here. So in my rush morning, I kept shaving, and so one side is off and the other side is here. I didn't have time to try to fix the rest, but it looks pretty cool. It's a new aesthetics for my appearance. And it's providing me with a fresh outlook. It's allowing me to, but I see myself right now on the camera here. This is not something that I normally would have happen. But I'm not concerned with, oh, well, I knew this Bateson call was happening, or I knew I would be interacting with people at work. I need to make sure, let me check in the mirror for 30 minutes. This was, oh, we gotta fix it up so it's at least tidy enough to step into the muddle of the world today. But how we present ourselves, and I can now, when I'm at my best, I can speak with a louder voice. I can have conviction. Yet those that know me understand that I will back down from any idea that feels like it needs to force itself through. But this idea of bigger aesthetics for me allows conflicting views, allows for a Trump supporter to be heard, allows for, well, we seem to have come to a conclusion over the past 15, 20, 30, 50, past 2 or 3 generations of the environment we're within, and we cannot do without this environment. So that is one big picture, that one aesthetics of how we manage and present our earth. That's something pretty much everybody can grapple around. So that's a good place to start. And since we're all on the earth, we all have these perspectives. And I think I threw in the question about phenotype and genotype and this biological versus cultural evolution, because we are one of the few species that has the ability to project into the future, to adapt from, or each generation can build off of the next, more so than say a crow can. Each generation, it might take thousands or hundreds of thousands of years from the point that they learned to crack the nut for them to teach, say, the sparrow to crack a nut or something like that, or even some other. So the crow has its own family, but to teach other bird species how to do these things, is that possible? I don't know. But even within the crow family, it might not necessarily be within a generation that they're saying, well, Johnny Crow here cracked a nut, but let's observe him and now everybody can do it. It might take a certain mutation or something like that within the crow species. And then as humans, we could perhaps add a third eye to the crow and add a certain memory function to its brain in order for it to pass that on. But then that would be forcing something upon the crow. And we have the capability of doing that with humans as well. So yeah, we have natural biological codes. We have these from the cellular level all the way up to the cultural codes, which have some biological basis how it's determined. So yeah, it's quite a bit of nesting going on. So
I think this is about control is different from influence. And there's a difference between control and anticipation. Living systems are anticipatory, and we're surrounded by the invisible, and we have to find ways of converting the invisible into the visible, so that we can have communications. And I remember, I think the difference between gene-centrism, the gene-centric view, the selfish meme view, brought forward by Dawkins and the New Atheists, back in the 80s and the 90s, really just saw the living body as a dead end. That it's all an illusion to benefit the selfish genes, which are replicating themselves through this meat, through this sack of meat. And I was revolted by that, aesthetically revolted by it. And I have done everything I can to bring this forward in every conversation I can, to say this is bullshit, bullshit. The genes do not call the shots. And I remember, this is before the Human Genome Project had been finished. The speculation was that there were many more genes than the Human Genome Project showed, that there are fewer genes, much fewer genes than were predicted, and that they don't call the shots, they don't control. There are influences, depending on how the genes are read, and that can be used, and that's extremely complex and culture-driven. What I eat, the behaviors I engage in, my diet, exercise, not or lack of exercise, the relationships that I have, the feelings of being included and accepted, the feelings of being rejected and excluded, all of that influences my hormones. And all of that has an influence at the cellular level. And these are multiple ways of communicating. So that gene-centric idea comes out of the 50s, of this control and predict idea. If you just know the genes, and this is, you can get rid of cancer. You can also, they claim, get rid of homosexuality. So there was a theme that ran very deep, that we can get rid of all the things that we don't like about other people. And wouldn't it be great if you were a parent and you could do a test and you would find out that your baby has the presence of the gay gene? You could abort that baby. Hey, that would be a win-win, right? This is the kind of rhetoric that I believe revolted me. And after the human genome proved to be pretty much a flop, they started to see this, the epigenetics, what was beyond what could be coded, and has a huge influence. That's why I knew being gay had nothing at all for me to do with my genes. It had everything to do with affection, who I wanted to affiliate with, who listened to me and paid attention to me, the people who liked my jokes, the people who did not like my jokes. These are the gestures that some people enjoyed, the gestures that people said, oh, that guy's a fag, stay away from him. The mixed messages I got was like, people who knew me and liked me would sometimes come up to me and say, you know what, that guy over there, he's a queer. Did you know he's a faggot? Yeah. I was like, well, guess what? I'm a faggot too. And then they would get mad. They said, well, why didn't you tell me? And I would say, well, why are you such a homophobe? So we would get into these horrific, and these were in relationships which were symmetrical. But I was in asymmetrical relationships with people who had power over me, who could decide whether, I could have a job or not, or work or not. And they were homophobic. So I had to find ways of passing in certain kind of situations. I had to learn how to pass. There's certain kind of situations where I could let go of that need to pass because I was already part of an affective zone. And I think these are the kind of things that are not going to be understood by a gene-centric obsession with digital. This is very fluid and generative and layered and complex. And when you're dealing with that, you're not dealing with rules, you're dealing with principles, especially if it's complex and perturbed, or complex and unstable, which is what we're in now. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there because I think this is front and center in this book, Biosemiotics. And I believe in this book, Pioneering Work. I think Bateson was tracking this. And I think he says you just can't reduce biology and culture to physics. It just does not work. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there as a personal kind of experience that I've had of how this of scientism can be used and hooked up with certain kinds of religion and hooked up with the state. So you have the state, the religion, the science, all producing so-called objective responses to a certain population. And I think this is something that we need to be extremely mindful of.
And it's still, I think I mentioned in a previous conversation, maybe in our Manning discussion, that it's still going on with mental retardation, that each parent is asked that question. And I personally take it highly offensive that it would even be brought up. So I can only imagine how something that affected you so personally would make you feel. You obviously express it still here, or it's still present with you to a certain extent of, yeah. So it's good for those of us that have the feeling, the sense of, well, I know Bateson says that we need to trust the system, but that's a different type of system he's talking about than the systems that humans perhaps have placed into place. But that's all I had to say. I'm running to the bathroom.
Oh, I wanted to come back to the issue of a larger aesthetics. I mean, I agree with you, Johnny, on much of what you said. It's part of this discussion actually about acquired characteristics in the phenotype and the genotype, because the separation between phenotype and genotype was based on the idea that the gene contains all the essential information for life. And the modern view is not that. The modern view is that there's the gene and there's how the gene gets expressed. And the processes that lead to gene expression are not DNA-bound processes. They're separate, and they operate in different ways, right? So it's part of the work that my brother does in the mathematics of gene expression in chaotic dynamics, you know? So it's not at all, or it's not all deterministic in what goes on in that level. So there is a kind of there has been a shift in the scientific world away from this gene-centric understanding of things. But to go back to so one of the, so I keep referring back to this discussion we had the other day in the Writers Underground group. Marco said, quote, "Poetry is actually the root exercise of deconstruction," unquote. So I think this is
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
This is the larger aesthetic that Doug is talking about.
Geoffrey, your screen froze, and the last sentence you said sort of broke up. You were quoting Marco. Could you repeat that quote again? Because I didn't get it.
Yeah, poetry is actually the root exercise of reality construction. And it's just so deep that we don't even notice it because it's so ancient and so deep. You know, I'm taking notes on that discussion. I'm transcribing the discussion because there's so much stuff in it that was gorgeous and deep in what we were exchanging. But I think that's the larger aesthetics that Doug is talking about. At the very bottom level, our reality is constructed more through poetry than it is through objective understanding of the world, right? So
did you guys flesh that out in the conversation? Because that's sparking quite a lot of thought right now.
Was that the conversation that you did?
I was not there.
Yeah, that's right.
But I'm thinking quantum poetics and how it's easy on the poetic level to talk about the quantum relation, but once you bridge into larger work, then it's hard to.
Let me. You can listen to the discussion, but
right.
Let me.
So you'll transcribe it. That'd be great.
Let me read some of the transcription that I've done of it. So Marco says, my ontology is that logos is at the heart of reality, and logos is something that is uttered. We can participate in logos. We can participate in a dialogue about the construction of reality. Poetry is actually the root exercise of reality construction. And it's just so deep that we don't even notice it because it's so ancient and so deep. The founding premises of our lived reality are actually poetic. That's my ontology. That's my faith. And then he says, what do you think about that? That's really radical. What is the purpose of poetry? It's not just decoration on reality. It's meant to go deeper than that. It's meant to get at the heart of things. And then Heather says, that resonates very much with the way I look at it, more so than even being a poet. That's more true to my being than being a poet. It's more about the co-creative nature of reality, the no-scenes or the implicit intricacies that poets work with, but that you can work with to create. To me, creation is poiesis and autopoiesis. Anyway, maybe I'll just stop there because there's more of it, but it was this idea of the importance of the poetics as the root understanding of things. There was another.
That's kind of what I don't want to go too deep into it, but I keep talking about storytelling society, but I feel like that when I desire to sing a song, when I want to stay within the moment, when I want to co-create with others around me, especially in these calls and in these discussions, there's a freedom, a certain sort of freedom that allows for what Marco phrased much better than I can, but that it's no need to think, no need to, it's the underlying logos, I guess, the underlying momentum within each moment. So ideally, the three of us here we could either be in silence and be completely connected, or we could say one word and then John, and then you would say one word and it would interloop like that, the way I'm imagining it. Or one of us would break out into song that spoke the exact words that need to be heard at that moment.
So let me just read Marco again. So this gets to quantum poetics. Geoffrey, your poem was all about the body. Incarnations. There is the body of the poem. There is the feeling that it carries. Particular words and their precision is what allows it to carry, allows it to work as a body, to breathe. What's interesting, it is not a material body. In a poem, we can share our body. We can share the body of the poem. It's a sacrament in that way. It gives a kind of shared body in a way. Isn't that weird? That's Marco. I also wanted to come back to, you're talking about your hair and the cutting. So somebody gave me an electric razor at Christmas. I actually did use it to
watch out, they're dangerous.
to change my sideburns a little bit. And several people commented to me how wonderful my hair looked. And it was the first time I ever did anything like that in, I don't know, 30 years, you know. So,
but even that can be poetic. Like I imagine not a haircut every 2 weeks, but each morning or in the morning and evening, you can just take it and take chunks of words, hone it down into a poetry of some sort.
Yeah.
Of course, the muddle comes back. So you've got to continue.
And these days I seem to be wearing either blue and pink. It's kind of funny because I'm so focused on gender issues these days, but my fashion choices seem to have narrowed themselves down to blue or pink as a choice. And so today I wore pink with a clear sort of intention about it. Because it's not that transgressive for men to wear pink, but there is a little bit of an edginess to it that I like. So again, aesthetics at that level, and it's one of the reasons why I like fashion is because we can play with these negotiations with other people through fashion, right? So it's actually aesthetics that has both beauty and power in a way. Power in an aesthetic way. Yeah.
As we go through our transitions, I think you've noted you're ending your educational career to a certain extent, and I'm going through my midlife contemplation mode. So perhaps I might get a tattoo or change my hair to green or baby blue or pink like your shirts.
And also, this is your self-presentation is a communique.
Yeah.
It's not just something inside of you that wants to get expressed. It's also something outside of you that gets accepted or rejected or something in between. And there are people who use fashion to transgress. And this is what was happening in the gay movement in the 80s and the 90s. You would see men with beards walking down the street with a veil, with a fedora hat and a veil, which confused people because it was masculine and feminine at the same time. And they would go shopping, walk down the supermarket with this getup, and maybe long black gloves to go with it, evening gloves you would see in a woman. So they may have a mix of male and female gender, and I think that was done in the sense of play, and it freaks other people out. And I think that is something that confusion is not within that person. The confusion is in that outside of that person. And they want you, wait, you got to stop that. You have to conform to this or that. You can't be both at the same time. It drives me crazy.
or a gay couple with children. Oh my God. Exactly.
Same-sex marriage. We had to repeat that intentionally. Same-sex marriage, 100 times a day for 20 years. And eventually people just started saying, same-sex marriage, same-sex marriage. I heard that 100 times a day. Maybe that's the trend. And it became the trend. That's how powerful language is. You can use language to divide. You can use language to do something different and provide contexts. So you had something like marriage, and then you had same-sex, and then you brought together same-sex marriage. And I think these kinds of conceptual blends are very fluid in our digital discourses right now. We're being barraged by multiple messages, and they're given and received in very mixed ways. So I think this is our challenge. But I just want to say one thing. Just want to quote from our author, because he's talking about the personal pronoun I. And he's talking about the different, and communication, and the inside and the outside. And you may not recall when I do these clean language exercises, I often ask a person, what kind of I is that I that wants that? And you'll often find people, when that question starts to register different kinds of affects because they realize the personal pronoun I contains multitudes, as Walt Whitman used to say. I contain multitudes. There are many kinds of expressed and acknowledged and unexpressed and unacknowledged. And that's in the affective zone, and that's the somatic intelligence. It's not to be confused with our genetic code. But anyway, I think this is something that Bateson knows, and he's talking about the I as a material object. And he says, I, however, exists in the communicational world as an essential element in the syntax of my experience and in the experience of others. And the communications of others may damage my identity, even to the point of breaking up the organization of my experience. Perhaps one day, an ultimate synthesis will be achieved to combine the Newtonian and the communicational worlds. But that is not the purpose of the present discussion. And he goes on to talk about the different kinds of scientists. He's talking about, on one side, we have Democritus, Galileo, Newton, Lavoisier, and Darwin. And then he goes on to talk about the less respectable views of Heraclitus, the alchemist William Blake, Lamarck, and Samuel Butler. He says this latter group, the motive for scientific inquiry was the desire to build a comprehensive view of the universe, which should show that man is and how he is related to the rest of the universe. The picture which these men, and I believe Marco, our friend Marco also was describing, they were trying to build something that is ethical and aesthetic. And he goes on to say, talking about materialism, today, if asked the same question regarding the meaning of materialism, I would say that this word stands in my thinking for a collection of rules about what questions should be asked regarding the nature of the universe. But I would not suppose that this set of rules has any claim to be uniquely right. The mystic sees the world in a grain of sand, and the world which he sees is either moral or aesthetic or both. The Newtonian scientist sees a regularity in the behavior of falling bodies and claims to draw from this regularity no normative conclusions whatsoever. But his claim ceases to be consistent at that moment when he preaches that this is the right way to view the universe. To preach is possible only in terms of normative conclusions. So I think that's very deep and could be read many times. And so I'm glad we're getting this chance to do this together, because I read this many years ago, and now rereading it, I'm finding why it needs to be reread, because it's a very contemplative kind of book.
Yeah, I had highlighted the same passages. He says somewhere else, I'm trying to find it too, he talks about the I as being, as one view of the I is as a set of habits and a set of can't remember the other idea there, but a kind of an expression of the I, and then a set of habits, and that's a way of understanding the I. It's a kind of psychological understanding, but it's a very interesting one in this kind of fragmenty way, and the importance of habit in that. When I was reading that, I was thinking, I read recently an article by a scientist, kind of an unusual scientist, I think, who was questioning whether or not consciousness exists. And he was dismantling some of the ideas around consciousness and suggesting that most of what we think of consciousness is illusory. He's not the only one who talks about this. There are several people in the world that do that, but it was kind of an interesting. It was in New Scientist, I think, but I was reading it.
But my response is almost always illusory according to whom? There's no such thing as an observation that is not made by someone.
Yeah.
They're in a performative contradiction. They're basically saying, giving you a meta message, this statement that I'm making is false. Because they're saying this statement I'm making is an illusion.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm therefore an illusion. And why should I trust you and I are an illusion? A self-proclaimed illusion. It's a performative contradiction. And I think they have real trouble if they want to base policy upon these very fragmented views of
Oh, I think they're
just
interesting, though. I do find them
well,
interesting.
they're very interesting, but I think when we stop looking at there's a personal pronoun I, there's a you, and then there's a we, and there's a them, and then there's an us, and there's this body of experts who are making these claims as objective claims based upon this procedure, but they're looking at closed systems rather than open living systems.
Yeah.
I think that's where we get into huge trouble and make these kind of grandiose statements as they often make, is that, oh, well, you're just an illusion because I've taken this off the table, that off the table, that off the table. I have this I've kept on the table. And based on what I've kept on the table, you don't exist. But then they have amnesia for all of the stuff they've taken off of the table.
Another discussion, perhaps for another time. We're at the top of the half hour, the 2 hour slot. So maybe call it a wrap for today. Johnny, you agreed to do the next session, which is the double bind and brings back the Diderot learning piece, which I think would be good, right?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. But it'd be a big challenge for me, but a good homework assignment because it's just totally loaded with interesting stuff.
And I also wanted to note that this was the 9th week. It's gone quickly. But we've gone through a hell of a lot of stuff in 9 weeks. And I think that 21 weeks is the total thing. So we're almost halfway. But I have to say, I feel like, holy crap, the stuff we've already gone through. How can there be as much and more on another whole slew of stuff? But Bateson is like that. He's a extremely deep and sustained reader in the other sense of sustainability than the one we just questioned. But,
yeah,
so I just wanted to sort of notice that this has been a journey. It's been a journey that I find enthralling in going back in and looking at Bateson sentence by sentence and idea by idea, because as you said, there's so many interesting and nuanced and important ideas that I think have been largely forgotten because nobody reads it at this level anymore, you know?
And I'm so glad that you had the brilliant idea of presenting this along with the Nora, because I believe there's something, a meta communications that are happening between the father and the daughter and between us and the father and the daughter. Because you can hear these intergenerational echoes that I don't think you could get by reading her separately from this, which I did. I read her, and about a year ago now I'm rereading her with this book. And I'm just seeing all kinds of things that pop up that weren't there before. So I think this is great.
I agree completely. I'm loving this. Still having trouble with Gregory Bateson. I've grown to love Nora Bateson. I think I mentioned when I first dove into it, I was thinking, oh, just another poet of some sort. But there's more to her poetry than what you look at on the first page. And I'm interested in starting a reading group 30 years down the road on whatever website is available or virtual site or with my own family or something like that, and seeing how that ties into the intergenerational activity there. Perhaps we could ask Nora's daughter to participate then, but
or granddaughter.
That's right. I'm a changed man because of this, so I appreciate that. And thank you for leading next week, Johnny. March is looking a little bit less bumpy for me, so I'll have access to time to read and think about the material, so I can take on 2 weeks from now if we don't
That'd
have
be
anyone.
great. I have to say this week was tough. I mean, it was a lot of thinking, and
you really clarified quite a bit with your presentation, so I thank you for being coherent.
Okay. So see you all next week.
You bet. Have a good week, guys. See
Okay.
you next time.
Bye-bye.